Obviously, you all know why we're here, so I'm going to do just a little bit of an introduction. We tend to live in kind of a first name culture anymore in the United States, and I've always kind of gone back to, like, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of Brazilian soccer, and there was all these famous one-name Brazilian soccer players like Pele and Jairzinho, and nowadays there's Ronaldinho and Ronaldo and all these guys. But if you loiter around fact and fiction as much as I do, you start to hear like Jim's coming in today, or Jim called yesterday, or we need to get the conference room ready for Jim, and you realize that Jim is James Lee Burke. So he's kind of the Beyonce of fact and fiction. Where is she from? Oh, that's right, Louisiana. Yeah. Well, Jim was born in Houston, Texas, which figures prominently in his new book, The Jealous Kind. You know, I'm very fortunate to be up here introducing Jim. I'd rather be with Jim than Beyonce. You know, he's won 2 Edgar Awards, which is kind of the mystery writer's equivalent of winning a couple Oscars. He's a grand master in the mystery writing world. He's published, what is it? I lost it in here. 30-some books, right? 35, 36, which is more than most people read in their lifetime. And what amazes me is the quality and productivity that Jim continues, you know, year after year. There's a new James Lee Burke book out. And what a lot of people don't realize is that fact and fiction is Jim's home bookstore. So what happens is when his book comes out, you know, a month or so before it hits the streets, a couple pallets are delivered to Missoula, and Jim sits behind a mountain of books that we feed him, and he signs a couple thousand. And then those go back on pallets and get shipped out to bookstores all over the country. We get orders through Fact and Fiction, you know, international, that then come in, another shipment that he'll sign, and those, some of them are personalized, they go out all over the world. So I think sometimes we tend to take for granted a little bit just this magnificent resource we have living in our community, that people around the world would love the opportunity. You know, before I got to know him a little bit, I once sat across from him in a Les Schwab, waiting to get our tires changed, and I was shy about approaching him and said, you know, remember that book you wrote? But now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit, I'm happy. I think if I saw him at Les Schwab, I would probably sit down next to him, because above all else, if you spend any time around James Lee Burke, you know that he's the penultimate gentleman, and that, more than anything, is what makes me happy to see so many people here to see his event. So what we're going to do here is he's going to read a little bit, and then I'm going to ask him a couple questions just to kind of loosen up the floor, and then hopefully a number of you will have plenty of questions so that we can involve as many in the conversation as possible. So without further blather, James Lee Burke.
Thank you for that very nice introduction, and also for your reception. I appreciate y'all's being here. I don't know, can you hear me all right? Okay, swell. I just saw 2 gentlemen out there dressed in Union officers' uniforms. I thought I was hallucinating. And I did something really I shouldn't have. I walked up to the one gentleman and I said, "Don't y'all know who won the war?" But he took it in good grace. Anyway, this is a true story. We're talking about the war between the states. There was a famous Confederate cavalry officer known as Fighting Joe Wheeler, and he was a great strategist. And he resigned from the Union Army when the war broke out. And in '66, after the Confederacy conceded, he went back into the Union Army. That was fine. But in 1898, he was still in the Army and at Kettle Hill with Teddy Roosevelt. and the Spanish-American War, except Fighting Joe by this time got a little confused about which war he was in. And he was charging uphill with all these black soldiers from the 9th Cav. That's how they took Kettle Hill with the 9th Cavalry. It was a black unit. But anyway, Fighting Joe looked over his shoulder and he saw all these guys behind him in blue pants, with khaki shirts. But he suddenly hollered out, "Hurry up, boys! Those damn blue bellies are right behind us!" Imagine what these other guys thought. Our lives are in the hands of a lunatic whose brains have been dead for 35 years. So we'd have problems with leadership today, but think about those poor guys. All righty. This book takes place in 1952, The Jealous Kind, and the title comes from a song. It was written by a guy from Abbeville, Louisiana. Bobby Gerard, I think, was his pseudonym, but his name was Bobby Guidry, and he wrote "See Ya Alligator." Anyway, I borrowed his title. And this deals with the 1950s from what I think, at least I think, is a more realistic perspective, because the portrayal of them was, in television. It has nothing to do with reality. Anyway, I'd like to read this short excerpt, and then we talk about fiction writing in general, if you'd like. There was a time in my life when I woke every morning with fear and anxiety and did not know why. For me, fear was a given. I factored into the events of the day like a pebble that never leaves your shoe. In retrospect, an adult might call that a form of courage. If so, it wasn't much fun. My tale begins on Saturday at the close of spring term of my junior year in 1952, when my father let me use his car to join my high school buds on Galveston Beach, 50 miles south of Houston. Actually, the car was not his. It was lent to him by his company for business use, with the understanding that only he would drive it. That he would lend it to me was an act of enormous trust. My friends and I had a fine day playing touch football on the sand, and as they built a bonfire toward evening, I decided to swim out to the third sandbar south of the island, the last place your feet could still touch bottom. It was not only deep and cold, it was also hammerhead country. I had never done this by myself, and even when I once swam to the third sandbar with a group, most of us had been drunk. I waded through the breakers, then inhaled deeply and dove into the first swell and kept stroking through the waves, crossing the first sandbar and then the second, never resting, turning my face sideways to breathe until I saw the last sandbar, waves undulating across its crest, gulls dipping into the froth. I stood erect with my back tingling with sunburn. The only sounds were the gulls in the water slipping across my loins. I could see a freighter towing a scow, then they both disappeared beyond the horizon. I dove headlong into a wave and saw the sandy bottom drop away into darkness. The water was suddenly frigid, the waves sliding over me as heavy as concrete. The hotels and palm trees and the amusement pier on the beach had become miniaturized. A triangular-shaped fin sliced through the swell and disappeared beneath a wave, a solitary string of bubbles curling behind it. Then I felt my heart seize, and not because of a shark. I was surrounded by jellyfish, big ones with bluish-pink air sacs and gossamer tentacles that could wrap around your neck or thighs like swarms of wet yellow jackets. My experience with the jellyfish seemed to characterize my life. No matter how sun-spangled the day might seem, I always felt a sense of danger. It wasn't imaginary either. The guttural roar of Hollywood mufflers on a souped-up Ford coupe, a careless glance at the guys in ducktail haircuts and suede stomps and pegged pants called drapes, and in seconds you could be pounded into pulp. Ever watch a television portrayal of the 50s? What a laugh. A psychiatrist would probably say my fears were an externalization of my problems at home. Maybe he would be right, although I've always wondered how many psychiatrists have gone up against 5 or 6 guys who carried chains and switchblades and barber razors and didn't care if they lived or died and ate their pain like ice cream. Or maybe I saw the world through a glass darkly and the real problem was me. The point is, I was always scared, just like swimming through the jellyfish. Contact with just one of them was like touching an electric wire. My fear was so great I was urinating inside my swim trunks, the warmth draining along my thighs. Even after I had escaped the jellyfish and rejoined my high school chums by a bonfire, sparks twisting into a turquoise sky, a bottle of cold Jacks in my hand, I could not rid myself of the abiding sense of terror that rested like hot coals in the pit of my stomach. I never discussed my home life with my friends. My mother consulted fortune tellers, listened in on the party line, and was always giving me enemas when I was a child. She locked doors and pulled down window shades and inveighed against alcohol and the effect it had on my father. Theatricality and depression and genuine sorrow seemed her constant companions. Sometimes I would see the cautionary look in the eyes of our neighbors when our parents were mentioned in a conversation as though they needed to protect me from learning about my own home. In moments like these, I'd feel shame and guilt and anger and not know why. I'd sit in my bedroom wanting to hold something that was heavy and hard in my palm. I didn't know what. My Uncle Cody was a business partner of Frankie Carbo of Murder Incorporated. My uncle introduced me to Bugsy Siegel when he was staying at the Shamrock Hotel with Virginia Hill. Sometimes I would think about these gangsters and the confidence in their expression and the deadness in their eyes when they gazed at someone they didn't like. And I'd wonder what it would be like if I could step inside their skin and possess their power. The day I swam through the jellyfish without being stung was the day that changed my life forever. I was about to enter a country that had no flag or boundaries, a place where you gave up your cares and your cautionary instincts and deposited your heart on a stone altar. I'm talking about the first time you fall joyously sit down in your soul in love and the prospect of heartbreak never crosses your mind. Her name was Valerie Epstein. She was sitting in a long-bodied pink Cadillac, what we used to call a boat, in a drive-in restaurant wrapped in neon near the beach, her bare shoulders powdered with sunburn. Her hair wasn't just auburn, it was thick and freshly washed and had gold streaks in it, and she had tied it up on her head with a bandana like one of the women who worked in defense plants during the war. She was eating French fries one at a time with her fingers and listening to a guy sitting behind the steering wheel like a tall drink of water. His hair was lightly oiled and sun-bleached, his skin pale and free of tattoos. He wore shades even though the sun was molten and low in the sky, the day starting to cool. With his left hand, he kept working a quarter across the tops of his fingers like a Las Vegas gambler or a guy with secret skills. His name was Grady Harrelson. He was 2 years older than I and had already graduated, which meant I knew who he was, but he didn't know who I was. Grady had wide, thin shoulders like a basketball player and wore a faded purple t-shirt that on him somehow looked stylish. He had been voted the most handsome man in the school not once, but twice. A guy like me had no trouble hating a guy like Grady. I don't know why I got out of the car. I was tired and my back felt stiff and dry and peppered with salt and sand under my shirt, and I had to drive 50 miles back to Houston and return the car to my father before dark. The evening star was already winking inside a blue band of light on the horizon. I had seen Valerie Epstein twice from a distance, but never up close. Maybe the fact that I'd swum safely through a school of jellyfish was an omen. Valerie Epstein was a junior at Reagan High School on the north side of Houston and known for her smile and singing voice and straight A's. Even the greaseballs who carried chains under their car seats and stilettos in their drapes treated her as royalty. Get back in the car and finish your crab burger and go home, a voice inside me said. For me, low self-esteem was not a step down, but a step up. I was alone, yet I didn't want to go home. It was Saturday, and I knew that before dark, my father would walk unsteadily back from the ice house, the neighbors looking the other way while they watered their yards. I had friends, but most of them didn't know the real me, nor in reality did I know them. I lived in an envelope of time and space that I wanted to mail to another planet. I headed for the restroom on a path between the passenger side of the convertible and a silver-painted metal stanchion with a speaker on it that was playing Red Sails in the Sunset. Then I realized Valerie Epstein was having an argument with Grady and on the brink of crime. Anything wrong? I said. Grady turned around, his neck stretching, his eyelids fluttering. Say again. I thought maybe something was wrong and y'all needed help. Get lost, snarf. What's a snarf? Are you deaf? I just want to know what a snarf is. A guy who gets off on sniffing girls' bicycle seats. Now beat it. The music speaker went silent. My ears were popping. I could see people's lips moving in the other cars, but I couldn't hear any sound. Then I said, I don't feel like it. I don't think I heard you right. It's a free country, I said. Not for nosy frumps, it isn't, he replied. Leave him alone, Grady, Valerie said. What's a frump, I asked. A guy who passes gas in the bathtub and bites the bubble. Somebody put you up to this? I was going to the restroom. Then go. This time I didn't reply. Somebody, probably one of Grady's friends, flicked a hot cigarette at my back. Grady opened his car door so he could turn around and speak without getting a crick in his neck. What's your name, Pencil Dick? Aaron Holland Broussard. I'm about to walk you into the restroom and unscrew your head and stuff it in the commode, Aaron Holland Broussard. Then I'm going to piss on it before I flush. What do you think of that? The popping sound in my ears started again. The parking lot and the canvas canopy above the cars seemed to tilt sideways. The red and yellow neon on the restaurant became a blur, like licorice melting, running down the windows. "Nothing to say?" Grady asked. "A girl told me the only reason you weren't won most handsome is that all of the girls thought you were queer bait and felt sorry for you. Some of the jocks told me the same thing. They said you used to chug pole under the seats at the football stadium." You didn't live in the 50s, man. Pornography was all oral or verbal and was an art form. I didn't know where the words came from. I felt like the wiring between my thoughts and my words had been severed. Cracking wise to an older guy just didn't happen at my high school, particularly if the older guy lived in River Oaks and his father owned 6 rice mills and an independent drilling company. But something even more horrible was occurring as I stood next to Grady's convertible. I was looking into the eyes of Valerie Epstein as though hypnotized. They were the most beautiful and mysterious eyes I had ever seen. They were deep-set, luminous, the color of violets. They were also doing something to me I didn't think possible. In the middle of the drive-in, my twanger had gone on autopilot. I put my hand in my pocket and tried to apologize for it. I put my hand in my pocket and tried to knock down the tent forming in my fly. "You got a boner?" Grady said, incredulous. "It's my car keys. They punched a hole in my pocket." "Right," he said, his face contorting with laughter. "Hey, everybody, dig this guy. He's flying the flag. Anyone got a camera? When's the last time you got your ashes hauled, Snarfus?" My face was burning. I felt I was in one of those dreams in which you wet your pants at the front of the classroom. Then Valerie Epstein did something I would never be able to repay her for, short of opening my veins. She flung her carton of French fries, ketchup and all, into Grady's face. At first, he was too stunned to believe what she had done. He began picking fries from his skin and shirt like bloody leeches and flicking them on the asphalt. "I'm letting this pass. You're not yourself. Settle down. You want me to apologize to this kid? Hey, buddy, I'm sorry. Yeah, you, fuckface. Here, you want some fries? I'll stick a couple up your nose." She got out of the car and slammed the door. "You're pathetic," she said, jerking a graduation ring and its chain from her neck, hurling it on the convertible seat. "Don't call, don't come by the house, don't write, don't send your friends to make excuses for you either." "Come on, Val," Grady said, "we're a team." He wiped his face with a paper napkin. "You want another Coke?" "It's over, Grady," she said. "You can't help what you are. You're selfish and dishonest and disrespectful and cruel. In my stupidity, I thought I could change you." "We'll work this out, I promise," he said. She wiped her eyes and didn't answer. Her face was calm now, even though her breath was still catching as though she had hiccups. "Don't do this to me, Val," he said. "I love you. Get real. Are you going to let a dork like this break us up?" "Goodbye, Grady." "How are you going to get home?" he said. "You don't have to worry about it," she replied. "I'm not going to leave you on the street. Now get in. You're starting to make me mad." "What a tragedy for the planet that would be," she said. "You know what my father said of you? Grady's not a bad kid. He's simply incapable of being a good one. Come back, please." "I hope you have a great life," she said. even though the memory of kissing you makes me want to rinse my mouth with peroxide. Then she walked away like Helen of Troy, turning her back on Attica. A gust of warm wind blew newspapers along the boulevard into the sky. The light was orange and bleeding out of the clouds in the west, the horizon darkening, the waves crashing on the beach just the other side of Seawall Boulevard, the palm trees rattling dryly in the wind. I could smell the salt in the seaweed and the tiny shellfish that had dried on the beach, like the smell of birth. I watched Valerie walk through the cars to the boulevard, her beach bag swinging from her shoulder and bouncing on her rump. Grady was standing next to me, breathing hard, his gaze locked on Valerie, just as mine was, except there was an irrevocable sense of loss in his eyes that made me think of a groundswell, the kind you see rising from the depths when a storm is about to surge inland. "Sorry this happened to y'all," I said. "We're in public, so I can't do what I'm thinking of. But you'd better find a rat hole and crawl in it," he said. "Blaming others won't help your situation," I said. He wiped a streak of ketchup off his cheek. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." Yeah, okay, thank you. That's very kind of you. I thought maybe I know that quite a few of you are published writers or people who are writing in one capacity of another. I know several of your names, so I didn't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about fiction or in general or publishing, or how you people ask how you get agents and things like that. I have had a kind of unusual career. I wrote my first short story. I started writing when I was in the 5th grade. And I was not a very good student in school, but I always loved books and I always wanted to be an artist. And when I was 19, I published my first short story in a college writing contest, and it won an honorable mention in the state college writing contest. And I met McKinley Cantor, the famous historical writer. And also met Irving Stone, who, and I was just 19. I mean, God, these guys were titans back then. And Irving Stone was such a nice gentleman. We had a little creative writing group at the college. I went to Southwestern Louisiana Institute, small school, it was poor boy school, and everybody was poor back then. I'll never forget Irving Stone, though. He was such a genteel and gentle man. And we were kind of intimidated by him because, he's very famous. He wrote Lust for a Life, the story of Vincent van Gogh, and The President's Lady, the story of Andrew Jackson and his wife. And there were several questions asked to him, and I've always remembered the answer all these years. Someone said, "Well, Mr. Stone, should you compromise and just write for money sometimes?" And he said, "Oh, no, don't do that. If you write a poem to pay the gas bill, be assured your utilities will be turned off." And then he was asked about his Hollywood experience because a number of his books were adapted for the screen. And he said, "Oh, have a grand time with it. Go to lunch with the people who are making the film and watch how they do it, and then get away from it, because you'll never change anything they do." He said, "You think you can influence it, but you won't. You'll just end up with indigestion at the end of the day." And it reminded me of something that I heard Ernest Hemingway say many years later. He was asked, if he had much trouble dealing with Hollywood, because he had enormous success with Hollywood. And he said, oh, it was easy. Well, what do you mean easy? He said, well, I live in Key West, so when I sell a book to Hollywood, I drive my car all the way to the Nevada-California state line. And I throw my book across the state line. Someone throws a suitcase of money back at me, and I drive home and go fishing. It's a breeze. That's a great story. But anyway, you learn from I've always learned, and I used to teach creative writing, that the best way to learn to write is to read the people who do it best, and never to read bad writing. You know, it's like, there's an expression, if you play tennis, don't watch bad tennis. If you watch bad, it messes up your own game. I think it's the same way with anything. But you read the people who are best. And I used, as I said, I taught I taught actually in 4 universities and 1 community college. And sometimes students would say, hey, Jim, you think I've got it? I got the talent? And I would never answer that question, because it's a wrong question. The person who knows he has it has a kind of quiet arrogance about him. He didn't care what other people think, couldn't care less, you know, just like, what do they know? You know, that's the only attitude you can have. But anyway, the point I was making, I had a lot of success when I was younger. My first cousin, he's passed away now, was Andre Dubusse. His son is a novelist, Andre Jr., who's very good. Was a National Book Award finalist. But Andre Dubusse, senior, was perhaps our greatest short story writer. I mean, going back to Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Andre was a great short story writer. And we more or less grew up together, and we were 4 months apart. We were always kind of competing with one another, although not in a bad way. I always admired, I always thought Andre's talent was greater than my own, and I learned a lot from the way he wrote. But it was his devotion to his writing. Andre couldn't care less if he made any money over it. He would get terrible reviews, and they usually come from people that, you know, there are 2 kinds of reviewers. There are people who are full of goodwill, and then there are those who, you know, just, you know, they would probably be political assassins. Writing terrible things about other people. But anyway, I published 3 novels in New York by the time I was in my early 30s, and I wrote my first novel on a pipeline. I was working on a pipeline at the time, and I had a teaching job, and I thought I was home free. And then I wrote a book titled The Lost Get Back Boogie, and I thought it would just be published. This would be my 4th one. No, it didn't work out that way. And I stayed out of hardback print for 13 years. And I couldn't sell anything. One novel in paperback, a historical story titled Two for Texas. But during that time, I amassed an enormous number of rejection slips. I had a huge box of them, and they were vile. Not just the printed ones were the kind ones, you know, the generic ones, you know, like, oh, we really enjoyed your story, but don't send us any more. But for some reason, the novel, The Lost Get Back Boogie, made people mad. And it was under submission continually for 9 years. And I received 111 rejections. And this is a legend in New York. It is the most rejected book in the history of New York publishing. But it was not only rejected, the manuscript itself had been brutalized. It had whiskey glass rings all around the margins. Cigarette burns. I'm not making this up. Like calcified worms, you know, on the manuscript, and stab marks from pens. One guy at a major publishing house wrote a 1-page, single-spaced letter full of just the worst things you can say about anything, you know, about this. Well, I won't even repeat it. It's worse than the stuff the language I was using. The guy was brought ready to have me, you know, sent to a concentration camp. They really got to it for some reason. And I never forget what this friend of mine, he's a the man I talk about all the time, he was from Brooklyn. He was a socialist plumber, and he gave me my most valuable artifact. I still have it. It's on my desk today. It is a glass, milk glass doorknob, both handles, from the bathroom of Boss Tweed. How many people own something like that? My friend Joe, he was also the plumber for Albert Anastasia. That's right. The guy was a lunatic, and not only conventionally, the mob couldn't do. He was the guy killed in the barber shop. Remember that scene that's in The Godfather? Anyway, my friend Joe once said, "Jim, you have a terrible curse. You're one of those guys who will be rich twice and go broke 3 times." I'm sure he was right. He had great insults. Things like, my favorite was, "You should have a house with 50 rooms and drop dead in every one of them." But anyway, the point is, my wife Pearl kept saying, send the book to LSU Press, Louisiana State University Press. It was after 9 years, and I did. And they accepted it. I cut 80 pages from it, and a lady retyped it for me, and it was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Same book. It's published all over the world today. I don't know how many languages it's been translated into. But I learned the system. I was only 20 years old. I'd write in longhand. I had a very small Smith Corona, and I worked a little while offshore, or seismograph. It was a seismograph drilling barge. And 10 days on the water, 5 days off. And I didn't have an address. I just would stay with friends when I was back on land. But so I rented a post office box, and I would send off all my stories. And then when I was on land, and I would write, and then mail my new stuff, and go back on the drill barge. And I created a rule for myself, and I've tried to keep it all these years. No manuscript stays home longer than 36 hours, a day and a half. That's it. You put it back in the system. You just keep it out there. And eventually it will, if it's any good at all, it will find the right person, the right editor will be sitting behind the desk. And that was my experience. It's just, you have to be persistent. You cannot believe in the naysayers. You learn this if you ever play baseball. The boos always come from the cheap seats. They're always from the bleachers. But the important thing is simply to be part of the action, to realize that if a person has a gift, it was instilled in him for a reason, and eventually that reason will become manifest in his life. I've always subscribed to that belief. So did William Faulkner. Right before Faulkner's death, he said, "Had I not written the books, another hand would have written them for me," as though he inherited a legacy rather than create one. That he had in his own life, a number of problems, of course, that probably contributed to his death, but he was a brilliant writer, and if anyone deserved the mantle of William Shakespeare and John Milton and Percy Shelley, it was Faulkner. But he always believed the gift itself was larger than he was, that it was not something that he could brag upon or claim credit for. And so Jack Kerouac was that way. I always thought that On the Road was maybe one of the best 5 novels written by an American. But I remember Kerouac was living in St. Petersburg in 1968, shortly before his death. And he was interviewed by Playboy magazine, and he was asked which writers he liked most. And Kerouac said, "I like them all." He said, "A good piece of writing is the writing that you write out of your heart, and you do it to make the world a better place." He said, "Let others be the judge of it, and don't listen to those who will denigrate it. Any writing that is written as well as you can is a good piece of writing. It's a work of art, whether it's rejected by the world or not. And a good friend of mine did a book, it was just called Oral History of the Life of Jack Kerouac, my friend, Bruce, anyway, a friend of mine ran an independent newspaper in Los Angeles. He interviewed Jack in a bar in Lowell, Mass, and just when Jack was at the end of the line, you know, he had terrible problems with alcohol and drugs, and he was only 47 when he died. And Bruce said Jack was talking about something that was kind of inconsequential, and then he turned to Bruce and pointed at him, and he said, "Your art is the Holy Ghost blowing through your soul." Boy, I just sense chills through me even now. But I thought, you know, Kerouac, that's it. He looked upon art as a metaphysical gift where you see beyond a dimension, and some people have it. Did you ever see the film Amadeus, the story of Mozart? It's a great film about the life of the artist and how he was despised by his contemporary Salieri, who was also a composer but didn't have, you know, Mozart's talent. I hope I'm not running over here. But anyway, Mozart had this enormous talent, but he was by and large in his personal behavior a buffoon. And the person he liked to mock all the time was Salieri, who hated, just despised Amadeus because God had given Mozart this wonderful gift. And Salieri, in comparison, was mediocre. For example, at a party there in Vienna, Salieri had just composed the sonata, and he had the music and, you know, the sheet music in his hand, and he said, "Amadeus, no one has seen this yet. I would like for you to play it here tonight. I would be so honored." And Mozart looked at it with a big grin on his face, put it on the piano on the little stand, then took off his shoes and played it with his toes. How about this? Salieri was to perform before the King of Russia, but he hadn't had time to prepare sheet music for all the accompanists. And so he asked Mozart, if Mozart is a slow learner, Mozart would help him out. Mozart, so I'm happy to. Well, he made the sheet music, copied it for Amadeus, or for Salieri, and waited till about 3 minutes before the performance was to begin, before he handed it to him. He had written out the score, all the notes and whatever, in 6 different colored pencils, 6 different colored pencils. It's like trying to read camouflage. The concert was a disaster. He was booed off of the stage. The king booed. It was the worst moment in Salieri's life. Well, here it is. We have a guy that is the equivalent of Mo Howard, you know, with this enormous talent, and everyone else wonders why. Why this guy? Well, nothing has changed over the years. But anyway, I said I was going to ask you if you had some questions about. How about some questions regarding fiction or publishing or anything at all? Yes, sir.
I was at a panel recently discussing how memoir these days is less truthful, and fiction, more and more writers are using elements from their own lives to fictionalize for their novels. Now, you've been on this run of novels kind of dealing with the Holland family that I've heard you say were very personal to you in ways that, you know, maybe some of the Robicheaux novels aren't, at least in relationship to your own life And I'm just curious to know how much of that, how much of your own life is being tied into this kind of written history you're developing for this one family. Because you've gone back generations over these last couple books.
No, that's a very good question. This has been my experience, and maybe every writer's experience is different, that the story, at least for me, is somewhere in the unconscious, and I've never known where it's come from. I use historical figures often and people I've known, but they change. You can try to control the figure, but he begins to speak and say what he wishes to speak. The characters take over the story. People often ask, well, do you outline your story? And I never have. Hemingway, again, said something very good, and probably no American writer has said as many accurate things about the process of writing as Ernest Hemingway did. He said, if he knew the end of a story, so would the reader. It's a very good line. But that's the way it's always been for me. I've never seen more than 2 scenes into the story. They're always there. I write in the middle of the night, and I sometimes write about 4 in the morning. I write in longhand, and I write early in the morning. After I get up, I write. I write through the day, and that's the way it's always been. I've never wanted to do anything else. And it's what Robert Frost once called a lover's quarrel with the world. That's what he called his art. I always thought it was a great line. Hemingway said something even better. Someone asked him just a casual question, like, what is your writing to you? And he said this extemporaneously. He says, he used the language of his time. It sounds sexist today, but he used the language and the metaphors of his time. It's back in the 1940s. He said, a writer must have the probity of a priest of God. He is chaste or unchaste, and in the way a woman is chaste or unchaste. Once he has done a piece of dishonest writing, he will never be the same again. And once writing has become his greatest virtue as well as his greatest vice, only death can separate him from it. Boy, could Papa say it or not? That's a sign, isn't it? He was a great storyteller. I knew his brother quite well. He was a good friend of ours, Lester Hemingway, and he was a grand guy. And he looked like his brother. He published 5 novels himself, and had a byline story in 1942 on the front page of the New York Times. It was he who broke the story of the German wolf packs, the U-boats that were sinking American ships off the coast of Jersey and off the coast of Louisiana too. They were sinking oil tankers. But I one time asked Lester if he'd come talk to my creative writing class, and he said, oh, thank you, Jim, but I hate to be George Washington's horse. How about this? Lester lived on an island in Biscayne Bay. He owned 2 islands. He had an island in Biscayne Bay and an island off of Bimini. And he had his own country, he had his own flag. And it was, anyway, Lester was a great guy. But anyway, he was so proud of this magnificent home he had. It was all Spanish stucco with Spanish tile in the middle of Biscayne Bay. And my little boy, Jimmy, and I and Hillary, that's Lester's daughter, and Lester and I and Pearl were sitting on the dock, and the children were fishing. The sun was going down, this molten red sun. It's just a magnificent evening. And I realized right across the channel was Richard Nixon's compound. Lester despised Richard Nixon. And I could see the lights in the back of the house. And I said, Lester, it just struck me. The effluent from Richard Nixon's house is floating past this dock. The kids are fishing. And he looked at me and he said, I have been in 2 wars. I have seen terrible things in my life. That is the most depressing statement I have ever heard. And he was serious. He was really dejected. He hadn't thought of it. It is a horrible thought. Anyway, well, how about some other questions? Yeah. Can I tell you this? Did I already tell you the story? Okay, all right. So, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I really like the Holland family, but I still miss Dave.
Uh-huh.
Are you ever going to do any more?
Well, I'm working on something now, but I never think about the work in advance or talk about why I'm doing it, with respect. And there's a reason for that. And that if a writer talks about those things, they go away from him. They will, they'll go away from you. Never talk about what you're working on. And it's like you have a confidence with the source. And as I say, to me, it's always been a mysterious process. I was talking about writing in the middle of the night. And I see things more clearly in the middle of the night. But I'm reminded of a couple of things that both Milton and Shakespeare said. Shakespeare's wonderful line, and I don't know if it was from Hamlet or not, but there's a line, all power lies in the world of dreams. I mean, this was 300, 400 years before Sigmund Freud. And also John Milton, in his blindness, he wrote on his blindness a sonnet, and he said he woke at sunrise to darkness, but he found illumination in the nocturnal hours. And the greatest living influence on my life, writer, was John Neihart, the man who wrote Black Elk Speaks. He was my creative writing teacher at the University of Missouri in 1957. John Neihart was a titan. Every writer of the American West, Louis L'Amour, it doesn't matter. Bud Guthrie would be one of the first to say, he's the man who opened all the doors. Everyone who writes about the West is influenced by Neihart. And of course, he gave us the story of Black Elk Speaks, but Dr. Neihart was a mystic himself. He grew up among the Oglala Indians in western Nebraska, and he was a very fine human being. He was just a wonderful soul. That's the only way you could describe him. And I never forget the thing. I would listen to every word he said. I didn't have to memorize it. When he said it, it went into a vault in my head. My wife is a poet. She was the same way. We met in grad school, Pearl and I, and we used to go fishing out at Dr. Neihart's farm. But he had an Indian prayer garden in his yard, and he was, I'm sure, a man who saw through the dimensions. He never talked about it, but the point is that he said that he wrote at night. This night, I said, well, why is that, Dr. Neihart? He said, that's when the voices of dead poets speak to you. Pretty good. Yes, sir.
I'm curious about that thing you just said, that business about not talking about what you're working on. It seems to me that's the most common writer's intuition I know of, other than I'm still smart when I drink.
Go ahead.
I wonder if you could just tell me why we all think that and why it's true. What is it about keeping quiet about what you're working on why do we all hold that conviction? I mean, I've heard it from everybody, including myself.
Well, this gentleman was just asking about why is it that speaking of one's writing in progress, why does it seem somehow diminished? I think number one, it's not supposed to be shared. It's supposed to be shared within a form. I mean, this ultimately is what art is about, emotion within form. Remember Benito Crochet, the famous esthetician and philosopher? He said that ultimately we take our emotions and we put them inside a form, and then it takes on the stability that allows us to maybe participate a little bit in eternity. And that's the way I've always felt. I feel also that the artist is supposed to give voice to those who have none. in that we're not supposed to do anything with the gift except render it in a way that makes it available to other people. Again, I think it's there for a reason, because it's given arbitrarily. I mean, we all know that. Look, I worked on a couple of films, a couple of motion pictures. There's no big deal, but I had a minor role. I mean, not as a writer, messing around and helping with the script and that sort of thing. But what impressed me most about the people on a movie set is the disparity in personalities. There are no two people who are alike. It's an open-air mental asylum, in the best way. I mean, let's face it, you'd rather hang around with 5 ad guys or a bunch of really happy lunatics. I mean, Burt Reynolds said this: why grow up when you can make pictures? Great line. Anyway, at any given time, there are 100 people behind the camera doing things. The camera's only focusing on a few, but here are all these other guys. And then you discover that, gee whiz, there are people here who are probably kicked out of the French Foreign Legion. They just got out of detox and the methadone clinic. They've got scorch marks from electroshock on their temples. They're brought in handcuffs from the city stockade for 8 hours a day. I'm not making this up. And they end up making a film like Gone with the Wind, The Godfather, The Song of Bernadette. So you say, how? God only knows. I don't know. They said, no, you say, this is a disaster. And you say, what do you mean? He said, it's terrible. Then you find out, the book suddenly appears on the screen. You say, gee, this is pretty good. How did it happen? And then, look, this, Michael Connelly, the writer. Michael's a longtime friend of ours. And he was talking to Dennis Lehane. Dennis wrote probably the best crime novel in the English language, Mystic River. It is an absolute masterpiece. And Dennis is a very good writer. Anyway, Dennis's adaptation, it was directed by Clint Eastwood, was a great film. And so Michael sold his novel to Clint Eastwood, and it's called Blood Work. And Michael said, gee, I'm so happy, because almost all the same people who made Mystic River, including the actors, were to be in Michael's adaptation. And so Michael says to Dennis, oh, golly, I'm really happy. I think that, maybe my film adaptation might end up as being as successful as yours. And Dennis said, I hate to tell you this, Michael, but Sean Penn, I said the same thing to Sean Penn. Boy, it's just great the way you guys made this film. I'm so proud and happy. And Sean Penn said, well, don't expect it to happen again in 1,000 times, because it was pure dumb luck. Talent and brains had nothing to do with it. Every film is a train wreck, and then sometimes you sort through things and they sell. I thought, golly, how depressing does it get? But I think that's it, that a person has look, George Orwell said it much better than I. He wrote an essay titled, Why I Write. And in there he said, every writer is possessed of an arrogance, of vanity. Every artist. He believes that somehow he sees through a lens and catches exquisitely a piece of truth, and he's driven until he can portray in that moment of truth in some fashion, either through music or through the written word or through painting, it doesn't matter. He has to somehow express that perception he has to other people, and if he doesn't do it, he will never be successful at anything else, and he'll never find happiness. And I've always tried to remember that. But anyway, I hope I haven't run on, and well, how about a couple more questions real fast? I just afraid I used up a lot of time talking parenthetically. And yes, sir.
Jim,
Yeah.
talk a little bit about archaeology at times. I know you practice some archaeology. Do you ever write about it?
Archaeology? Yeah, well, I'm very interested in history, and I used to belong to the Florida State Amateur Archaeological Society. We went on digs, but I'm fascinated with the past. I believe my father was something of a historian, and he subscribed to the notion that there is no past, present, and future. He believed that perhaps all time happens simultaneously, as though in the mind of God, like a dream. And he used to say, that's why we owe a debt to the dead, as well as to those who are not born and who will inherit the earth from us. And he said it's a continuum. And I think that, Santayana once said, without a knowledge of history, we repeat our mistakes. But Ron Hansen's a good friend of mine, and the man who wrote Mariette and Ecstasy, best metaphysical mystery story ever written, Mariette and Ecstasy, Ron Hansen. He also wrote Desperados. He's a great guy. But Ron always says that he writes historical books. He wrote Hitler's Niece. It's a dark view of course, Adolf Hitler. But Ron always says we have to give voice to those who don't have a voice. And I think it's one reason the Dave Robicheaux protagonist in a series I wrote set in Louisiana is so popular. Dave is the everyman figure out of the medieval morality play. He gives voice to those who have none. He is the blue-collar knight errant. He's Chaucer's good knight whom we meet in the Canterbury Tales. But all the great mysteries are there. It's just a matter of recognizing them. My father, again, used to say these things. Both art and science are not a mystery. They involve an incremental discovery of what already exists. It's already there. And that's the same with the human story. The great stories are in common people. William Dean Howells once wrote an essay about riding a horse-drawn streetcar in Boston during the 19th century, and he looked at all these working people sitting there. They were tired. It was the end of the day, and they were so tired they couldn't speak, and their clothes were soiled with coal dust. And he said he wondered how the experience of their lives, their suffering, their privation, did not burn through their skin like a candle inside flame inside tallow. In other words, the iridescence of the human spirit is in the breast of every human being. And the great struggles are in the lives of people who are faceless. Think about it this way. Try to think of the name of 5 slaves of historical importance. We come up with Spartacus and Harriet Tubman, 3 or 4 others. But think of the millions and millions of people who lived in thraldom, whose lives were used up for the profits of the few. None of those people ever had a voice, and it's like they call out to us. I believe that. They beckon us from the grave. They still want their story told, and I enjoy historical fiction. I read it a lot. But we went past the time. I want to thank you all. You've been just great.